We really just want to change the way people think about addiction. We want to promote the highest quality services in prevention, early assessment, and treatment of addiction.
From a financial standpoint, untreated addiction costs Canadians approximately $40 billion every year. Some say $52 billion. It costs a lot.
But about 80% of what we need to deal with addiction has to come out of our own pockets today.
We need to build a system, and it needs to be detox, treatment, and then aftercare.
Canadian Medical Association and many of us very vocally have been on record for the last several decades to decriminalize it and deal with it just as a fine system rather than a criminal offense. And that actually needs to happen with all drugs.
A lot of people think that drug use and substance use, substance dependency is addiction. It's not. It's a symptom of addiction. It's one of the most harmful and most alarming symptoms, but it is not addiction itself.
Denial is real, and it is the most dangerous illusions of this disease. Addiction is the only disease that tells us that we don't have it. I do not like anything that hurts. None of us do. It's our human instinct to go towards pleasure and to turn away from anything that hurts. To the addicted brain, this is tenfold.
So let me start with an admission. I'm high right now. I haven't used any substance, but I'm high. I am getting a big dopamine hit right now. I love public speaking. I find it thrilling, and I always have. It gets me excited. I'm lit up like one of Dr. Elliot Gardner's rats. And in fact, just the anticipation of today has been lighting me up for a couple of weeks now. So what's wrong with that? We should do what we love, right? Isn't pleasure good? Well, yes, but I have to be very aware. I know that I'm going to experience withdrawal tomorrow. I think I'm going to wake up and I suspect I'm going to be really anxious. And tomorrow will be a tough day for me. There'll be a lot of grandiosity. Oh, Paul, you did so good. You're so good. And there'll be a lot of shame. Oh, you blew it. You're such a loser. That's the way the disease works, that grandiosity, shame pendulum.
Behaviors are not the disease, nor do they cause the disease. They are symptoms of the disease. And behaviors can aggravate the disease or help lead to recovery.
I think if we understood addiction as the brain illness it is, and understood both the genetic and the social inputs to it, I think we'd probably do almost everything differently in our society. So while addiction is one disease, we come to it in a multitude of different ways. We have low dopamine receptors, we don't make enough dopamine, we don't release enough dopamine, we take it up too fast. Downstream, the receptor doesn't signal the signal well.
Neurologically, it is important to appreciate that the brain hasn't finished developing until age 25.
But if I knew about addiction and that it could manifest in other ways earlier in my life and knew what to watch for, then maybe I would have gotten help sooner, and maybe other people would too.
And so this is our FAMH estimates right now. So if 50% of those physical health conditions are rooted in addiction, and so when we add these numbers up, about 30% or 1.2 million Albertans likely suffer from some sort of moderate addiction. I think that's a lot more costly to our society and to our government than the other ends of the spectrum. We think that about 20% of people probably have some sort of severe addiction and 20% some sort of mild addiction.
This slide also you've seen, are you in a cage? Is the question I ask people. You don't need to be. It's addiction that puts you in the cage.
If we do a better job attracting people into healthcare, because it is healthcare, it's not addiction treatment, something outside of healthcare, but it's a patient who's suffering from an illness. It's a chronic illness, and if we treat it correctly and treat them correctly, they'll be more attracted into our system.
Just because you've stopped using drugs and alcohol doesn't mean you're doing better. And just because you haven't stopped, it doesn't mean that you're doing badly.
I am a student of this disease. I find the scientific basis to be very interesting. However, that can actually hamper my recovery at times because I do try to use my intellect to gain control over this disease, when in fact the key to my recovery is surrender based on spiritual principles.
And in Ayurveda, which I've had the privilege of learning about over the last 2 decades as a physician, having grown up with it in India, it says the first primary cause of disease is pragyaprad. And pragyaprad literally translates as a mistake of the intellect. And the mistake of the intellect is that it starts to perceive itself as being separate from the rest of the universe. If you're familiar with it, and if you look into it, you'll see that without any other intervention, just the intervention of meditation and yoga starts to change the brain. We can't have medication, yes, and that's a good thing, or medication, no, is a good thing. We all need to look at it in context, and what medication for how long. Which is why people sometimes get confused. People say, are you an abstinence doctor? I say, yes. And they say, but I've heard you talk about harm reduction. I say, yes. They say, are you medication doctor? I say, yes. But you're against medication. I say, yes.
And I've learned a new term. I was in a state of low dopamine tone.
The human gene pool has had addiction forever. So there's not a single person on this planet who doesn't have some degree of predisposition. And here's the other comment about genetics, that there's no untainted gene pool in the world when it comes to addiction.
And I think we have to understand that humans, like all mammals, can come to the biology of addiction from 2 ways. We can be born that way, but you can take a normal genetic mammal and induce addiction by lowering its dopamine, and we know there are 2 ways to do that. Make it feel subservient or physically isolated. And that will work for any mammal, including us. What is the experience of the low dopamine person who's told no? So if I came to you and I said, hi, I'm really feeling bad and I need some dopamine, and you said, no, Howard, you can't have any, I don't hear, oh no. My midbrain says, you're going to die. Addiction is really a disease of premature aging. If we live long enough, we will all get addiction because we're losing dopamine tone as we age.
People do not get addiction because of trauma. I can tell you story after story where addiction was unmasked when the trauma was going on. It just got worse. So someone who might be living their life with moderate addiction or mild addiction, and then suddenly this is introduced into their life, then it gets worse.
So if you look at what trauma is in a psychiatric sense, it is the expectation that you or somebody around you is about to die or be severely injured. So what happened to the monkeys might be best understood not as trauma, but as deprivation of social contact and being placed in a socially subservient role.
The Buddha would say that they call it Sangha, that community is everything. We grow in community. We laugh, we love, we hurt, but we're better together in community.